back to Flosstube University. These are tutorials designed to help new cross stitchers. We are making them with the idea that people who buy the patterns from our Cross Stitch the Globe shop would be able to use them, but then we're putting them on YouTube so anybody who comes across them can use them. Before we dive into today's topic, which is explaining what fabric count is in cross stitch and showing examples, we just want to say, if you want to see what we are stitching and learn all about the wide world of Flosstube and cross stitch on YouTube, subscribe, because every other Monday we do a full Flosstube episode where we discuss all the things we're currently working on.
And we both have all kinds of different projects, lots of different counts and fabric types.
And then those come out twice a month, and then the other Mondays of the month we do deep dives into like more advanced topics. So tutorials are for beginners, but definitely subscribe if you are interested in growing and sharing with us, because we are having so much fun doing our Flosstube.
It's so fun.
All right, so today we're going to talk all about fabric count in cross stitch, because if you are new to cross stitch and you have bought a pattern, it's going to tell you what count of fabric to get. Now, if you get a kit, it might just say, here's your 16 count aida, have fun. But you still might want to know, why does this aida feel different than the last kit that I did that was a 14? So right. Cross stitch count. So just like if you buy, 800 count Egyptian cotton sheets, a count of a fabric is just how many threads per inch there are. There are other ways to look at fabrics, but when you're talking about cross stitch fabric, is a woven fabric, just like bed sheets are woven. When you talk about count in that way, you're talking about how many threads per inch. Now, cross stitch fabrics are what we call an even weave. Some we specifically refer to even weave, but all cross stitch fabrics are even weaves, meaning that there are the same number of threads that go vertically, that lay horizontally, and as there are across. Now, this term, the threads that go like this, are called the weft.
The right to left ones are the weft.
And the ones that get woven through them are called the warp.
Okay.
Now,
and I learned that too. So
depending on the loom is set up, technically the weft are the ones that are there, and the warp are the ones that get woven through. So I guess technically it could be switched around, but either way, those are the two terms. And on an even weave, you're going to have the same number of threads on your weft as your warp. There are lots of fabrics out there in the world that are not even weave. So if you were just like buy a piece of regular like clothing linen and try to stitch on it, it might look super cool, but it wouldn't be an even weave, and you would have rectangular instead of square X's.
Squares, yeah.
Now, the most common counts in cross stitch, most people start out with a 14 count.
Which would be something, not that one, something this size.
And on a 14 count, that means you have 14 threads across and 14 threads going down per inch. And on an aida, usually on smaller counts, like 14 counts, you're going to stitch, each square is going to be over one box of thread, and that makes your square, it's called over one, but that means you're going to end up with 14 stitches per inch as well. Now, when you get to higher counts of fabrics, that will not be true, but in these lower counts, your count of fabric is 14. That means there's 14 threads, there's 14 holes, and you would have 14 stitches per inch.
Right. What
are some other common smaller counts of fabric?
Okay. So I started out with 14, just like a lot of people, we start out on 14. It makes our projects probably a good size. So if you wanted to, when you want to shrink, you can choose a higher count, and it will make your project smaller.
And that is a term that people kind of mix up. They'll say like, they'll say a smaller count fabric, and when really they mean a higher count fabric and smaller X's on the cross stitch. And so people will just use those kind of interchangeably. Technically, to go from a 14 count to the next one up, you're going to a higher count of fabric.
Right. So this one, the red one, is 16. You see how much smaller the box is than the 14 count.
And let's show we can show this. This is a 14 count, and let's show the 16. Yeah. So the X's on this 14 count and the X's on this 16 count, the X's on the 14 count are slightly bigger because you've got 14 versus 16 stitches per inch. All right, so 16. What's the next most common? Okay. Or not most common, what's another common?
So then another one, if I wanted to make it even smaller, I would go to the 18, the 18 size. So this is 18 count. 18. Oh, can't really see that at all, can you?
Yeah, it's focusing.
Okay.
And the benefit of an 18 is it makes it smaller, which makes your X's smaller, which makes the picture looks less pixelated if you're doing full coverage. If you're not doing full coverage, you're doing like a sampler. It also means your work can be smaller. It's easier to fit into a frame.
It is harder to work on, in my personal opinion. The smaller the stitches are, they're closer together. You have to consider if you're going to be beading, that you're going to have to change the bead size with the size of the fabric. So anyway, sorry, tangent.
What's the next one? So we got
Okay,
14, 16, 18.
20. Really tiny. Tiny, tiny, tiny.
Now, when you're talking about those smaller counts of fabric, 14, 16, 18, and 20, those are usually, I think, only on what we would call an aida fabric. When you get up into even higher counts than that, you switch from an aida to even weave. That's like, you might, there are versions called Lugano, there are versions called Verdal, but they kind of all fall under the even weave. And that's confusing because technically aida and linen and cross stitch are also even weaves. But when you see somebody list the option to buy as an even weave, it's usually it's a mix of organic and non-organic material. So you have even weaves and then you have linens, and the common counts for even weaves and linens, you'll see a lot of even weaves in 25 count. You don't really see 25 count linen.
Yeah.
The smallest of the linen counts usually is a 28. Now, this is a 28 count. That means I have 28 threads across. But when you get into a count this high, and this is not a truly high, but when you start getting into 28s, people
Remember, high means
the higher the count, the smaller the X, until you start stitching it over 2 threads instead of over 1 thread. So even though this is 28 and I have twice as many threads as a 14, the stitches are actually the same size because you're doing it over 2 threads. So here, let me see a 14.
this is the 14.
So the X's on these 2 pieces should be about the same, even though this is a 14, this is 28, because you're doing it now over 2 threads. You will see people stitch on linen over 1 thread, but it's not as common.
And we're talking.
Yeah. Now, with linen and with even weave in general, that's not aida, you go 28, 32, 36, 40. Then and when you start getting up to 40, you start getting people who can't do it because of eyesight issues. There are people who can't do even smaller counts than that because of eyesight issues, but 40 tends to be a place where people really start to use magnifiers to be able to see. Some people don't need them. Some people do.
Some people are blessed. Some
people
like us are not.
I can do some 40 without magnifiers in the mornings, but like not at night in my apartment. When you get up to 46 and 56 count, God bless you, and I hope you have very strong magnifiers. We know some people that do beautiful things on 56 count. Allison just shook the camera, but that's okay. But as you go up, again, so like the 32 count is going to look the same size as the 16 count if you're doing it over 2.
This is 16, I think. Yeah.
So if you think about it, like a 56 would be like doing a 28 count over 1, which is wild. So when you read your pattern, if you're brand new to cross stitch and you read your pattern, it will tell you what it was charted for. And it may not say like those words, but it may say like get a 14 count or get an 18 count. Recommended get a 28
size.
Count.
Yeah.
You can make changes to those fabric counts that you're using if you know what those changes will do.
Yeah.
So for example, this guy is charted for 18 count, and I have him on a 28 count, which means it's the equivalent of a 14 count. So he is bigger than he is charted to be, and I'm good with that because I know what I want him to, I know what size I want him to be. But if I was just going to read the pattern and buy the recommended fabric, I would have bought a different fabric. I would have bought an 18 count.
I can tell us a horror story. Read the pattern, because if it says like recommended stitch on, in the past I have gone by just, it says it's the finished product is like 11 by 11, and if you don't pay attention to what size the fabric that they're suggesting is, if you don't pay attention to the stitch size that is, then you're going to cut fabric the wrong size. They had stitched something on 40. I didn't pay attention. I just cut it out, and I did it on 14 versus 40. So 40 count would be like 20 tiny stitches. And so it was just a nightmare. It would not. There's no way in heck it would fit. I had to just really completely start over, and I had done a whole page. It's very sad.
So it's important when you're reading your chart to know what is this charted for, and then if you want to make changes, what is those change or those going to changes are going to do.
Right.
If something is charted for 28 count over 2 and you want to do 28 count over 1, it is going to be much smaller. There are totally reasons that people do that, and there are some really cool results from that. You have to know if that's what you want to do.
Right.
If you need beads, are you comfortable changing the beads? Because do you need to change the number of threads? So sometimes patterns call for blends, and that means you need 2 different thread colors at the same time. But if you're stitching it over 1 thread on 40 count, or if you're stitching it over 40 count on 40 count in general, you're not going to have room for 2 threads, most likely. There are exceptions,
or they'll be very fluffy. Yeah.
So
you have to want that.
Fabric count is, in the beginning, you're probably just going to say, okay, my pattern calls for 18 count. I'm going to buy 18 count.
Right. That's how I did it.
And then as you go, you might be like, this pattern calls for 18 count Aida. I would prefer to do it on a even weave, so I'm going to get 36 count. And then you might get to the point where you're like, this pattern calls for 18 count. I want it to be super tiny. I'm going to do it on 56 count 1/1 and turn it into a necklace. And people do that.
And it's cool.
But
it's so cool, the different things you can do by just changing the size of the count.
You just need to know like what the count is going to do to your stitches. So the higher the count, the smaller the stitches, up until the point where you go from doing it over 1 thread to over 2. And then you need to do some math when you're thinking about it.
Well, just think about it this way, like that you're doubling the amount of stitches you need to do if you go over 1 versus 2, right?
When it's charted for over 2.
When it's charted.
So you want to know like what is your pattern, like what's the call for fabric count, and then the call for fabric type isn't as big of a deal because if it's charted for linen, you want to do it on an even weave, that's fine. If it's charted for 40 count linen, you want to do it on a 20 count Aida, that's fine. You just need to know what the equivalences are. And so you need to know what it's charted for, and if it's charted for going over 1 thread, or if it's on a higher count, is it charted for over 2 threads.
Yeah.
And then a couple other fabric counts that you will see that are not as common, but you do see them, is 7 count, 11 count, 12 count, and 22 count. And 22 count is technically called a hardanger. And then
11. That's how big an 11 is. You can physically see the holes. Like,
yeah, they're big.
They're big. Once you get that, the stitches are going to be really big.
And then if you decide you want to do any stitching on non-traditional fabrics, you can figure out what the counts of those are by actually stitching and then seeing, whether you go over 1 over 2, count them, how many stitches are there per inch, and then if it's over 2, double it, and that's your count. But if it's a non-traditional fabric and it's not an even weave, you need to check both how many go on your warp and how many go on your weft, and then say like, oh, well, this is a 30 by 20 or 30 by 40. Whereas if it's a real cross-stitch fabric that is designed for cross-stitch, it's going to be the same in both directions.
Right. Even weave.
All right. I think that is everything people need to know about cross-stitch fabric counts. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Subscribe for more tutorials, and then we're going to put out short tutorials for beginners every week. We put out every other Monday, like real deep fun dives into our personal stitching and things going on with the shop and any other things you want to know about our lives. And then also on Mondays, we put out like deep dives into fun topics like what's the most expensive cross stitch pattern,
where do you get the freebie?
Which we have to do.
We're going to do that one. I'm not going to let you forget that. We're going to do that.
You can do the research for it.
Yes, I will. Okay.
All right. So subscribe for more beginner tutorials and also deep dives into the large world of cross stitch on YouTube.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.